It's books.
That's not working. Oh, I know why. Ha ha ha. We're live, everybody, and we're having technical difficulties as always, but let's get going for real now. Hello, 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 and welcome to Take Your Pick. This time we're going to be picking from books that you haven't read, or maybe you've read them, but our panelists haven't. Let's introduce the panel. Hi, I'm Chris, and I'm going to be your host and moderator this evening, and we've got a bunch of other people here. Actually, before I introduce the panel, let's talk a little bit about today's theme, because we are going to be looking at books. Now, no matter how well read you are, the number of books that you haven't read dwarfs the number of books that you have read. Oh, imagine the shame. Some of the people who are here tonight are professional teachers of books. Some of us have podcasts about books, and yet we are desperately underread. You know, there was once a tale, I think it was in a David Lodge book, about some grad students in an English department, and they do a drinking game where they have to name the book that they're most embarrassed they haven't read, and one of them mentions Hamlet, and basically that person's career is ruined because of that. But I've never read that David Lodge novel. I read about that in a book called How to Talk About Books You Haven't Read by Pierre Bayard, which is fantastic, and I completely recommend it. So that's what we're talking about. Today, our panelists are going to take turns picking a book that they haven't read and explain why they've chosen it. Maybe it's a book that they're ashamed that they haven't read. Maybe it's something they have vowed never to read. Heck, maybe it's a book that doesn't even exist. Once a panelist picks a book, no one else gets to pick it. And if there's a question about whether something counts as a book you haven't read, well, I'm the moderator. I get to make the final call. Though I doubt this time, with the sheer number of books that we all haven't read, that there will be any issues. We're going to do 3 rounds. Each panelist will walk away with a small library of books to put on their shelf and get around to, someday. But speaking of our panelists, we should introduce them. So let me check out what the random order that has been selected for us is. Very good. We have got first in the selection from the Fiasco Brothers Watch a Podcast, it's Sean Frost.
Hi, my life's an open book in a language no one knows.
And from Dear Reader, as well as This Is Your Mixtape, we've got Michael Collins.
Hi, I was just looking at our giant stack of unopened New York Review of books.
Still in their plastic wrap. We've got from no podcast whatsoever, but from everybody's hearts, Jessica Lockhart.
I wish I had read How to Talk About Books You Haven't Read. That would have.
And we've got from another megaphonic bookish podcast from By-The-Bywater, we've got Jared Pechacek.
Hello. My life is an open book as well, but it's mostly pictures.
And finally, my co-host on the Spouter-Inn, which is a podcast about great books, many of which I hadn't read before we started the podcast, Suzanne Akbari.
Hi.
Hello. All right, I'm your moderator, so I'm going to be gracious and I'm going to read out my unread books last. Also, if you're watching this live and you want to comment on any of our choices, that's great. That's literally why we do this show live, so we can incorporate your comments into the show. So feel free to type them in YouTube or Facebook's comment bar, and we should be able to see them and make them big on the screen for everybody. But that's enough of my jibber jabber. Sean, you're up first, so why don't you tell us about a book that you, shamefully or not, haven't read?
Okay. I may need to be cut off here because I've got a yarn wall of just how this book is connected to things. First, I'm going to show you what I'm not talking about, which is Dr. Mabuse, which is the English language translation of Dr. Mabuse der Spieler by Norbert Jacques. Now, this book was the basis for the movie The Silent Serial made by Fritz Lang. And about a decade later, they decided to get back together and go back to the Mabuse well and make another book to make a movie off of. So Norbert throws his ideas out. Lang says, "You're an idiot." And they come to some formal sort of agreement, and go write their own separate versions. Norbert Jacques writes the Testament of Dr. Mabuse, contracts it to be bound along with a reprint of Dr. Mabuse der Spieler, and Fritz Lang has his wife and collaborator, Thea Van Harbo, write the script based off of some of Jacques' ideas. Now it gets complicated because of two things. One is that Harbo is approached by American publishers who want her to write a novelization of the movie loosely based on Norbert Jacques' book of the same name. And the second thing is the Nazis banned the movie, so nobody wants the book. All of which is to say, I desperately want Norbert Jacques' sequel to this book. It was eventually released, but it is only in German and French. So somebody out there, please translate it so that I can find out what Norbert Jacques' version was.
All right. So that's the Testament of Dr. Mabuse?
Yep.
All right, took a while to figure out what book you were going for so I could put it up on the Chiron.
I'm sorry, I tried to, it's because I had to cut out so many of the threads of yarn going to different places.
Oh, very good. So yeah, that came out in 1932, it looks like.
Yep.
So it's a book that exists, but you can't quite read it.
I can't read it. Unless I learn German or French.
That's the solution.
French.
Get on it.
French.
Very good. All right. So the Testament of Dr. Mabuse. Yeah, I haven't read that either. Yeah, and I can read French, and I once passed a test that alleged that I could read German, but I really can't read German. So excellent. We will move on. Who did I say was second? Michael, I believe.
Oh,
yes. Here we go, Michael. What are you going to have not read?
Okay, so for people who know me, they might know a couple of facts about me. One is that I grew up in Newfoundland, and two is that I was doing a PhD in literature, and that my dissertation focused on Newfoundland literature, which people who aren't familiar with Newfoundland often are like, is there Newfoundland literature? Is there enough Newfoundland literature to justify a dissertation? Yes. However, it's not really well known outside of Canada and sometimes outside of Newfoundland. The one instance where Newfoundland does pop up in contemporary literature that people in the wider Anglosphere might know of is Annie Proulx's Shipping News. And you'd think I'd have read it, and you'd think wrong. So,
Wow.
I'm aware of it by reputation. And they made a Hollywood film of it, like an Oscar Beatty kind of thing. The accents were terrible. None of them got even close to correct. Judi Dench was like occasionally sort of veering towards, and then it was like whoever they hired to do the accent coach would like jump in and like correct her back to whatever wrong bullshit they were doing. However, the book, I've seen little excerpts, and I can't explain to you why I haven't read it. It is a very controversial book back home because Annie Proulx is American, and she had like a summer home in Newfoundland, and she would come there over the years, and she was her and Farley Mowat are the two outsiders I can think of who came to Newfoundland and were charmed by us half-savage rustics who were like, oh, it's like you're not even really part of the 20th century, and it's like you haven't been corrupted by capitalism and modern culture, and like, which is a very highly offensive thing. Like, it's not true, like, and also it's wrong. But I can't characterize the Shipping News as being like this because I only am aware of it by reputation. All I know is that a lot of people back home think that she got it wrong and that it's a very romanticized view of my home culture, which is this weird little island that no one really thinks about or cares about, but which is very much not part of the North American mainstream. And all throughout my dissertation, my committee was like, yeah, you probably should get around to reading that. And I would be like, I agree. And I would put it off. And now my brain is broken and I have great trouble reading like books. And I still haven't got around to it. I don't know if I ever will. And
sorry about that. Yes, I muted my mic for a minute. All right, the Shipping News. I tried to read that once and didn't get very far. I don't know if anybody here has read it.
I read it.
Yeah?
I liked it, but
friendship and love.
Yeah, I don't know. There's some very sweet character beats in it, about sort of moving away from the trajectory that you thought you had for yourself and reinventing yourself in a different mode or in a different way, and not in one of those like obnoxious sort of eat, pray, love kind of things, but of a more sort of soul searching kind of thing. But Michael, if you ever do read it, I would be curious what you make of it. But I also understand that you. Yeah, it would make sense not to have an obligation to read it. Yeah.
I don't like being told what to do. So after more time passes by, that pressure might dissipate and I might just naturally pick it up. So
Nadia wants to know, or if we can talk about how Sean has not one but 2 pairs of cat ears. Commit to the bit. And yes, if you're watching, you can please, if you're watching this live, feel free, drop some comments. We'll make them part of the show. That would be great. We'd love to hear if you have read or also never read these books. We'll see. So Jess, you have read Annie Proulx's The Shipping News, but what haven't you read?
Oh my goodness. Well, I can tell you about the book that I want to read next. It's called The City We Became by N.K. Jemisin. And I read The 100,000 Kingdoms, which is one of Jemisin's earliest works, but I haven't read this one, which seems to be about a struggle for the soul of New York City between sort of 5 avatars and the sort of Lovecraftian forces of white supremacy and sort of soul city destroying kind of forces that are at work in it. Anyway, it sounds amazing. And I would love to read it. I have pulled up the first little paragraph, and I'm already a little bit in love, and I would like to read it to you. I sing the city, fucking city. I stand on the rooftop of a building I don't live in and spread my arms and tighten my middle and yell nonsense ululations at this construction site that blocks my view. I'm really singing to the cityscape beyond. The city will figure it out. So anyway, I'm very excited to read this book, and yeah.
Excellent.
I wish that I could say more about it. Yeah.
I think that's about the shipping news. There's always a little lag.
Yeah, no, I read it, and it was a long time ago. Then I really question your sense of temporality. Yeah.
Isn't The City We Became an expansion of one of her short stories? Because I think I read the short story that it's either in the same universe as or whatever. It's really the story's really good. So.
New York City itself feels like a city that I don't know, or like a book that I haven't read in some ways. Like I know that some of the people on this panel have lived in New York City, but it's something I've only visited it a couple of times, and on the one hand, I felt this shock of recognition because here I was in all these places that I had seen on television, but I still don't feel like I understand the city at all. And in the book, it seems as though the city has 5 different souls or avatars, which I'm really excited to learn more about.
I wonder if they're for each of the boroughs.
That's exactly what I thought.
Yes, the book is based on her short story, The City Born Great. So there you go. Wikipedia knows everything. All right. I believe. Oh, I gotta write these things down. Jared, you're up next. What are you going to share with us?
Yes. So I have to admit I don't know precisely how to pronounce the name of the book, but it looks to me like Tales of Nevèrŷon by Samuel Delany, who is a science fiction, fantasy, pornography author who has written a lot of books. I've only read Dahlgren, which is fabulous. But this book, I don't know a lot about it. It just sounds really interesting to me. And the fact that my local library doesn't have it gives it this sort of tantalizing, like just out of reach feeling. She's just a really interesting author, kind of surreal and prickly and sexy, and I would just love to read more of his, and I just need to, I guess, buy the book.
So I have read Tales of Nevèrÿon and the complete 4-book Nevèrÿon trilogy. They are fabulous. They're absolutely fantastic. They are arguably his best work. Although there's a lot of competition for that. They're really great. They do a lot of the kind of work of rethinking about fantasy from an anthropological and non-white perspective that Ursula Le Guin also dealt with in Earthsea, for example. And the later books get really interesting and deep into theory. There's one of the last books came out in I think it was written in 1984 anyways. And one of the stories flickers between the fantasy world of Nevèrÿon that Delany created and his own experiences going through the AIDS crisis as it was unfolding as a prolifically sexual gay man. It's really interesting. It's really startling. It's a fantastic turn in that series. I strongly recommend these books. Couldn't recommend them more highly.
Did you realize Chris was like a Samuel Delany mega fan? Like, did you know that, Jarrett?
No.
Yeah.
I am a very big Delany fan. I think I only have ebooks of those books, however, so I can't go grab one off the shelf. Got to meet Delany once. That was cool.
Really?
Wow.
Yeah. That's a story for another day, though. It's nothing too exciting. I just got your pick.
Yeah.
All right. Jarrett's Samuel Delany's Tales of Nevèrÿon. That's fantastic. Suzanne, what shall you be?
This was such an interesting task to think of books that might fit in this category, like books I haven't read. So they might be books I'm embarrassed not to have read, books that I'm saving to read. We talked about some like this. And I was also thinking about books that are lost, books that are inaccessible in some way. And we already talked about that a little bit. And so I've studied medieval literature for a long time. And one of the things I was fascinated by very early on was lost books. So the Middle English writer Chaucer, who was writing around the year 1400 or so, a little before that, refers in a couple of his different works to he has a kind of catalog of his books. And he does this in his Legend of Good Women in the prologue, and he does this also in the introduction to his Man of Law's Tale. And he's giving a list of all his books, and among them he puts the Book of the Lion. And we don't know what it is. It's gone. We have no idea. And so I was curious about that for a long time. But the book that I want to pick out here in this moment is not the Book of the Lion. Don't do it. Don't do it. Don't do it. Stop that, Karl. But another lost book from right in the same period called the Avision du Coq, the Vision of the Cock, right? Vision of the Rooster. So Avision du Coq. And it's by Christine de Pizan. And she mentions that in one of her other works. Again, lost work. And I got obsessed about this book for a period of time when I first read about it. So like early 90s, I guess. And I really tried to research as much as I could to figure out what it might be, what it could possibly be about. I actually interrogated this researcher, the grande dame of Christine de Pizan's studies. Her name was Charity Cannon Willard. She was a lovely person. And so I cornered her at one point and I explained this obsession to her and tried to get her to speculate about where you could look, what could be possible. And she said, well, maybe, she said she'd wondered about it too. She thought maybe there was a courtier or something who had that name and it was a political parody or something. No clue. This is just speculation. So I have some ideas about what it could be because there's floating around in that period in the Middle Ages, there are different versions of an Islamic narrative of the Prophet Muhammad's ascent into the heavens, and it focuses on. It includes an episode with a giant sort of rooster marking out one of the boundaries in heaven. And there's other old French versions of this and so on around. So it's my secret fantasy that if we ever found the Avision du Coq, it would be a really interesting kind of crossroads of different currents in the medieval past. But we'll never know. I mean, I don't think we'll ever know. I wish somebody would find it, but it's tantalizingly on the horizon.
Medieval books do sometimes get found. So
I know. I wish they would. I would be so happy.
That's beautiful.
I want that book.
That is great. Yeah. And Christine de Pizan, of course, generally speaking, a very interesting writer. We had a comment a little while ago about the book that Jess picked, which is just to say somebody in the audience really wants to read that one too. And fair enough. Yeah, N.K. Jemisin, somebody who's been on my list to check out at some point as well.
I just ordered mine from Baka Phoenix, and I want to thank Kai for the recommendation.
Excellent. Baka Phoenix, local, fantastic, historic local science fiction fantasy bookstore here in Toronto. Yeah. It's my turn. Oh, man. That's not the book I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to be talking about a book that some of you have heard me talk about before as a book that I haven't read. And I guess there's no reason to beat around the bush. I'm going to be talking about the Lord of the Rings.
Whoa.
Now, I tried reading
Shame.
well,
This is a safe space for you.
I tried reading The Hobbit as a kid, and I bounced off it. I was probably a bit too young, or maybe, I don't know. I don't even remember how young I was when I read it. So I might have been quite young. But it just didn't work. I didn't even get like 10 pages in, I don't think, in this illustrated version I was reading. So it kind of put it off for me. I then went and grew up a little bit. And as a teenager, I read lots of derivative of Tolkien science fiction, right? David Eddings and things like that. That was my main literary diet for a while. But I never got around to Tolkien. And then, I stopped reading as much fantasy. And so I just wasn't on my radar. Eventually, I went to grad school to do a medieval studies degree. And as some of you know, a lot of people get into medievalism through Tolkien and Lord of the Rings. And everybody that I was around knew the set of references. And I can get really prickly around that kind of hegemony. And obviously this is the best possible hegemony, but nevertheless, I'll be like, you know what? I am determined that either I'm going to get my PhD in medieval studies without having read this Tolkien text that is a touchstone for everybody, or I will not read it, or I'll just leave the program at some point, which is in fact what happened. So I have finally purchased from my local bookstore a brand spiffy new set. I've got audiobooks lined up that were recommended by friends over at By-The-Bywater. This is my big project. Unfortunately, Spouter-Inn, we do quite a lot of reading for that. And if you're reading books like Vanity Fair, oh boy, it's hard to sneak in a little thin book like Tolkien in there.
You need to do a novella cluster.
Yeah, we've thought about a short story cluster at one point, but yes, so that is my big, and Nadia is on my side. And I know that there's somebody else in the panel who hasn't read Lord of the Rings.
I have read The Hobbit a few times.
I also bounced off The Hobbit. I couldn't read it as a kid. I read it much later. So that bouncing off part is totally reasonable.
I read The Hobbit as a kid, and I was old enough to think that, it was easy to read and I could follow the plot and thought it was completely childish. It wasn't until coming back to it this last year that I was like, oh, the writing changes things. So I was old enough to be stupid about reading it.
That's a great line.
I mean, I am a little anxious that Tolkien is something that you have to be indoctrinated into young, because I've definitely gotten that sense from some people before. But, I'm going to give it a try.
You revisited some of your Tolkien derivatives a couple of years ago and enjoyed that, though.
Yeah, but that was nostalgia. Like, I definitely would not want to read The Malorian cold now. There's no point in doing that. Do not read those books. They're not very good. I got a lot of nostalgia value out of revisiting them, but don't.
I don't think you have to be indoctrinated in order to enjoy it. I think it's maybe a mistake to if somebody's looking for fantasy recommendations to be like, oh, we've got to start with Tolkien because you might bounce off of him these days, But
yeah, and you probably could just read N.K. Jemisin instead.
Yeah, if you're going to buy books, support living authors.
Exactly. Excellent. Well, so that was my first big shame moment or moment. Sean, you had Norbert, Jacques, and we're back to you with the Testament of Dr. Mabuse. So, what is the second book that you haven't read?
What do I? Oh, maybe it's time for Sean's moment. But no, I mean, honestly, one of the things when I listen to your show is that, like, I've read like 2 of them that you've talked about, and the rest of them it's like, that sounds great, I should read that. And so I could just sit here and read off what books you've covered, but this one's a little more personal, which was I'm a big. One of my many failings is I'm a big anime fan, and I watched a series called The 12 Kingdoms, which kind of captured me with its imaginative mythology. And it probably only seems imaginative to, my Western eyes. It's apparently rooted in some Chinese mythology. But I found the source novels, and there are many. This is the first one, Sea of Shadows. And basically, by Wikipedia's count, there are 9 books that Fuyumi Ono has written in this series. And I picked this up maybe 10 years ago, and I have not read it. And the reason I have not read it is because the American publisher of the English translations did 4 of the books before folding. So I can read 4 of these, and that's it. So I keep putting off starting because but it won't go anywhere.
It's so sad.
Yeah. I know. I keep running into these language problems. I need a universal translator.
Oh, very good. Well,
like Matrix download like a dozen languages into your brain.
Yes.
The problem
my
with the
cyberpunk
working
future.
progress. Yeah.
yeah, I'm 100% on board with that. I mean, much as I love learning languages, I'm fine with just having them downloaded.
Yeah.
There's something bittersweet about starting a series that you can never finish, too.
Right.
And sometimes it's because they're not translated. Sometimes it's because the author decided not to finish the series. Yeah, it's just. But they get you anyway. It's upsetting.
Yeah, I'll probably get around to it, knowing that I'm going to dead end at some point, and just be grateful for what I have.
Yeah.
But it's hard when you've got to stop. I mean, the ones I have pile up like this. That's a lot of text to invest in to never end.
So, is the anime complete?
No. I mean, they sort of wrapped up the story points they touched on, but it only covers basically the first, maybe second book.
I also tend to refuse to read books in series when the series isn't complete, which is why I ended up missing out on Harry Potter, because when my roommate was getting really into it, it wasn't done. So I was like, well, I'll wait a few years. And then when it finally was all out, I was like, actually, I probably don't need to read that anytime soon. I did eventually read the first novel, but in Latin. So there.
I read the first one in Canadian.
There you go.
Yeah. I specifically went to, while I was in Canada, picked it up because I refused to read the American version that got rid of the Philosopher's Stone.
Yeah, the Sorcerer's Stone. What is that,
It's a real thing, right?
I mean, it is now. I mean, and we expect real things in our fantasy books.
Yeah.
Wizard of Earthsea. Where the hell's that? It's not on my atlas. Okay, Michael, you had any Proulx, the shipping news? What else will join that?
All right. Okay. So this is more. I'm sort of realizing as I'm looking over my list here that a lot of my books I haven't read that I think I could talk about, I can talk about them because it feels disobedient that I haven't read them. So when I was in my undergraduate, it was the last year of my undergraduate degree in English literature, and I was at a university that had a very stringent honors program. There was a list like 13 or 14 long of like various courses you had to do. You had to do like a British literature course, American literature course, Canadian literature course, bibliography, crap like that. You had to do 2 theory courses, 4th year seminar. The first one started off with Plato and Aristotle and went up to Percy Bysshe Shelley's Defense of Poetry. And the second one would pick up from there with your Freud and your Marx and come on right through to the early 21st century, I guess. I don't know where it ended because in my last year of undergraduate, that second course got canceled. The prof who had been teaching it didn't want to teach it anymore. No one else in the department was capable and willing because they had not hired a new professor for something ridiculous like 12 years. So they just waived the requirement for our entire cohort. And I showed up for my master's program with a knowledge of literary criticism and theory that ended in the 1830s. And I signed up for a theory seminar as one of my master's courses. And we threw me right into the deep end right away, with Levi-Strauss, Derrida, what have you. And I came to really love critical theory. But I never, ever, ever read any Marx. So I'm going to say the Communist Manifesto. Because it's a manifesto. I could knock it off in like an hour, I'm sure. Like, it's not long, my understanding is. And I know that in a lot of progressive spaces, it's kind of like almost a running joke, like, oh, have you read Gramsci? It's like, no, I haven't read fucking Marx. So my shame is endless. I've not read the Communist Manifesto. Take me to the guillotines.
Okay, done and done. I've also not read the Communist Manifesto, though I have read other Marx and a little bit of Gramsci, but not much. You don't have to read Marx to read Gramsci, I don't think.
Well, this is kind of the thing. Like, one of the reasons that I haven't is because I've absorbed so much of it secondhand, because I've been around a lot of people talking about it, and like the ideas. It's like I haven't read very much Derrida either, but all throughout grad school, it's like, oh, your work is so Derridian, and I'm like, picked it up secondhand. Like, so
there you go.
I have also not read the Communist Manifesto, but then again, I'm a fourth generation Michigander. I was born with my own shack in the woods and manifesto already written. So,
all right, excellent. Well, from there, Jess, you had N.K. Jemisin's "The City We Became." And what are you going to add to that pile, that dusty pile of books?
Oh, well, the next book that I have on my list is a book that I have looked at very closely, but I have not read. And I choose it in order to tease apart the relationship between different types of reading. So this is actually a book that, surprise, Chris Piuma owns. The book was inside the house. It is a book that Chris's friend got while backpacking, or so I understand it. And then Chris himself kept. This is the legend about the book. And in the project that I'm working on right now with the book in the Silk Roads, we needed a book that we could use to test a micro CT scan. So I borrowed this because I thought it would be more interesting than some of the other books that we had on hand to test the machine, and it was absolutely amazing. So what it is, as far as we can tell, and I want to thank my friend Arca for some of this information, is that it's a book with a bamboo outer cover and palm leaves that are joined together by strings through the middle. There it is. And you can see it's a set of images, and also there's some Dravidian script in there. And we think that it's Buddhist content, but we're not entirely sure. And the ink has been scratched into the surface, basically, where someone carved the images and then rubbed ink over it. And it's a beautiful little book that really does fun things to sort of, especially for people raised on European codex type things. It's a really neat way of recognizing that there are many different types of books out there. But so I have looked at this book, I've handled it, but I wouldn't say that I've read it. But I can say that I've looked at it in an unusual way. And so I'd like to share that with you now, if that's possible, Chris. There we go. So this is a micro CT image of this book. And what I love about this image is that it just looks like a UFO. I mean, it's beautiful. And it doesn't show any of the contents of the book, but it does show very intimate things about the structures of the plants that they're like cell structures from, for instance, the bamboo that lived until it was turned into a book, and the cell structures of the palm leaves in the middle and the thread going through it. And I just think that it's a really neat book, but I would love to read it more properly. So that's my book. There's another image of it. We're working on how to be able to read fragile books, which, unlike this one, are not easily opened. So, yeah, hopefully there will be more book reading in the future.
That's super cool.
Wow. Yeah.
Yes. Sorry. Let me undo all the things I've got going on. I've got. It's
That's amazing.
The string has gone wonky now. I will try to fix this later when I'm not doing a live stream. But here we go.
Hooray!
Oh my gosh. How old is that?
Well, I got it 20 years ago. It's not old. Like
Okay.
I'm fairly confident that this was a thing that was being sold to tourists by my friend who was spending a few weeks or months, I forget, wandering around Indonesia.
Okay.
But it's still cool.
And it's an old book format.
It is a
Yeah.
very old book format. Yeah, no, that type of book has a long history, which I am not qualified to say anything more than that about.
I think that one of the stories I've heard is that oh, never mind. I won't tell the story.
Okay. You'll have to stay tuned for Take Your Pick After Dark to hear the rest.
I love what you were talking about at the end there about books that are too fragile to open and books we haven't read because physically they are too delicate. And that's an amazing thing to think about. And the fact that you're working on technologies to get around that.
Yeah, I think it's very beautiful, I think, to think about books through time. And some of us on this call have had the privilege of reading books that are copies of copies of copies of books that were written 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago or whatever it is. And I think it's really neat thinking about the ways that all the literatures that we're reading have such amazing, wonderful roots, going back through all of these books that we haven't read. And yeah, I just find it really beautiful. And I want to give a shout out to Suzanne and Chris also for their work in letting us know some of these roots in books that we haven't, that underlie our culture without us knowing it.
Oh, well, that's very sweet. Thank you. All right. Well, after from the first numbered book in my library shelf, Piuma Catalog 1, we're going to move on to Jared after Tales of Nevèrÿon. What other delight have you not read?
Well, I don't want to follow the Paul Leaf book. I'm going with something that is foundational, and we all know the story, but I've never read it because I saw the TV version. Don Quixote. It's when was it written? It's 16 something, I think. Spanish novel, obviously. We all know Don Quixote, but I've never read it. I don't know why. I feel like when I was younger, after seeing the TV version with what's his face, John Lithgow. It's like, well, I know what happens. That was kind of, I didn't like that. But I bet the book is better.
It's crazy long.
Yeah,
but it's also really weird and interesting.
Yeah. I'm getting over my youthful, judging things by the TV adaptation. So I'll read it eventually, but for now it's something that I haven't read. It's on the, it's way down the road somewhere, but I'll get to it.
Oh, did not mean to do that.
One of those mountains on the horizon.
Oh yeah. Really good. Yeah.
Don't
TV version. You mean the musical or
no? There was it was made for like ABC or something. It was like 1999. It had John Lithgow. I forget who played Sancho Panza, but it wasn't really that good.
No,
I saw that.
John Lithgow.
Wow.
Yeah, I saw it at a young age. Thought
it's Bob Hoskins as Sancho Panza.
Right. Okay, now I remember it. At the time, I was like, it's me.
It itself is a book about a book that they haven't read, in that it's their own book that they haven't read.
Mm-hmm.
And like near the end, Sancho Panza says, someone asked him why he doesn't follow around Don Quixote, why he continues to follow around Don Quixote. And he basically says, I've been beaten, I've had all these things happen, but it's nice not to know what will happen next. And I think that's really beautiful, especially for someone like you who loves adventure. I think it might be really fun.
I will say, if you read the book, and it is a big mountain of a book, don't feel you need to finish it. The book will go on, and It does not necessarily, like, you'll get the point.
How
Yeah.
long is it? Because I want to say, I think the longest, is it longer than Moby Dick, or is it?
Oh, yeah.
It's about, at least about.
I'm pretty sure it's-
And it's in 2 big parts.
Okay.
But if you read like the first, I don't know, couple hundred pages, the first like several chapters, you get there's a lot of goodness there. Like, in other words, that would be just worth it, even if you only read that the first little bit, because it's crazy.
Okay.
And there's a really good translation that I can recommend, which is quite funny, which I don't remember off the top of my head, so I have to go downstairs to check it out. But I really enjoyed it. If you remember, it's the one that we taught, Suzanne, when we...
I think it was the Penguin edition. I'm pretty sure.
It is a Penguin edition, but I think they've got a few editions.
Wow, there he is, the man.
God.
So that's,
Wow.
yeah. And Bob Hoskins looking very good. But yes, all right. Well, so Miguel Cervantes, Don Quixote, Suzanne, along with the Avision du Coq, what have you got for us?
So sometimes we haven't read books because we know we should, but we just haven't gotten to it, or we know we should, but we just tried and we really hated it. And sometimes, for me at least, and I don't know if others have this feeling, sometimes there's a book I want to read and I think about it, but it's hard to read. Like, it's emotional for some reason, or it's just odd in how it kind of strikes me. And an example of this kind of book, and I'll be curious if some of you have read it and to hear what you say, is Kazuo Ishiguro's Never Let Me Go.
That's on my list.
Is it? I'm sorry, but but it's a book that I've known about for a long time, and in fact, I even wrote an article that was on the idea of the human. It was like a review article, and I ended up quoting bits of it, like secondhand from somewhere else, or maybe even pulled out a couple quotes, but I didn't read the book, and it just seemed. And I love Ishiguro in general, right? So I thought it's going to be beautiful and painful and sad and moving, and so I really want to read it, but I'm also like shook up by it ahead of time. And so that's a book I haven't read, but I really want to read, but I think I will read, but I don't know when. I don't know if anybody else, I would love to hear what you guys have to say about that book, those of you who've read it. And also if you have books that are like that, where you want to, but you're kind of push-pull relationship to the book.
There are certainly books that I like. I don't think I have the emotional stamina for this right now. And it's interesting because when will you?
Yeah. There's some
like this.
There's some books like that I will never read. Like what is it? The Road. What is it? Cormac McCarthy.
Terrible.
I will never read that book. I'm sure it's a beautiful book. I'm sure it's a great book. I will never read that book. It sounds just awful. Like
it's not good at all.
Oh, okay, good. So
I'm a fan of Bleak, and I'm not reading that.
Nadia says we should definitely read this book. If we
She's very firm on this.
Yeah. So I think it's the question of being in the right place. Like, I feel like it's a book I will read, but it's going to require the right moment, like the right period of time. And I don't know exactly what that will look like.
Yeah.
You sort of had a response like that, maybe not quite exactly like that, but with Beloved.
That's true. You're right. We talked about that. You're right.
When the first time you read it, you were...
I couldn't.
Yeah, you couldn't, because there's terrible things happen to young children in that book. And you were a mother with young children, and it was just like, too close. Sure, it's good. Can't. Got to put this down now. So maybe you'll find a time for it eventually.
Yeah, maybe we will find a time.
Maybe we will. That's also true. But we will not find time for The Road.
No.
Those books that you're afraid to open, though, sometimes for me, part of it is sometimes that I'm afraid that it'll change me, or that I'm afraid that I'm not ready for that change that will happen when reading it. And yeah, it's worth sitting with those kinds of feelings. At least I've found, and then it's really a great pleasure when you actually do. So
yeah. I mean, I really like Ishiguro. I've read a couple of others of his, and like this is his most famous, I believe. And like I've also sort of steered around it. I can't articulate quite why, but it might be something similar. I don't know. It feels like it would be a lot.
All right. Well, excellent choice. It's my turn again, alas. So thanks to the podcast, the Spouter-Inn, that Suzanne and I do, I've been crossing off a lot of the books and authors that have been on my to-read list that have been on there for, since I was a teenager, let's say. In particular, I've been woefully underread in African American literature and authors. Not completely unread, but like nowhere near as well read as I should be, especially in, well, I guess in all sorts of things, but especially in the classics, right? So for the Spouter, I finally read the autobiography of Malcolm X, which was terrific. And I finally read some Toni Morrison. I read The Beloved for the show. I read The Bluest Eye as well. Really fantastic. They're great authors. I should have read them long ago. Not for the Spouter-Inn, but also recently I finally got around to reading some James Baldwin, who is of course great, like obviously. So there are still plenty of other people who I've been missing, and one of the big names on that list of somebody who I've been meaning to read forever is Audre Lorde. She was a writer in the second half of the 20th century, died far too young from cancer, described herself as Black lesbian mother warrior poet, which is all good. She was an activist and theorist who helped develop some of the ideas of intersectionality, and like people just love her. The book that I'm going to name in particular is Zami, which is a new spelling of my name, which is her autobiography, or as you might be able to see there, I'll move that, a biomythography. I don't know a tremendous amount about the book, but it incorporates, biography, history, myth. And with the Spouter-Inn, we've been looking at a lot of autobiographical works that aren't really what you might think of in the traditional autobiographical mold. They're not just, I was born to these parents, and then I had these adventures, and now I have done this thing that you've heard of me for, and now I am dying, or whatever. Like, they're not that. They're doing something much more interesting, whether it's, Malcolm X's, posthumously published autobiography, whether it's Gertrude Stein's work, whether it's C.L.R. James's Beyond a Boundary, which we'll be looking at next, whether it's another, there are plenty of other books. Anyways, I'm super excited about this. It sounds super interesting. I really need to get this off my reading list and into my brain, as well as probably some other works of hers. So Audre Lorde is my choice. Nice. I don't know if any of you have read this or any other books by her.
Oh, no, but you need to hear what you think about it.
Yeah, I've read a little bit of her poetry, just a little bit, and I don't remember it much, but I'm super curious to see some of her, especially nonfiction writing, creative nonfiction writing. Oh, and she went to the same high school I did.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I did not finish at this high school, but we both went to Hunter High School in New York, Hunter College High School. So she a few decades before me. All right. So that's my second pick. Let's see. We've got one more comment here from Nadia, who reminds us that indeed Never Let Me Go is heartbreaking. Fair enough. But it's time for round 3. This will be our final round. You'll get one more book to talk about, and then we'll have a round where everybody can say other books that were on their mind, but not go on about them for quite as long as we do right now. So we're going to start once again that is last week's script. We're going to start again with Sean, who had The Testament of Dr. Mabuse and The 12 Kingdoms Sea of Shadow. What will be joining them?
Okay, so this is another one I have that I haven't read, and it's actually fairly short. And my only reason that I haven't read it yet is that I expect it's going to be really, really powerful. And I need to be in a better headspace for that. And that is The Spook Who Sat by the Door by Sam Greenlee. And this was an incendiary novel that got turned into a movie in the late 60s, very early 70s, I think, that so frightened the FBI that it was they leaned on the studio to recall and destroy all copies of it. The only reason that the film exists is because somebody misfiled a copy. And it's basically the story of an FBI agent who is specifically hired to be visibly black so that they can claim they don't have a race problem at the FBI. And he keeps his nose down and he dots all his I's and crosses all his T's and learns as much as he can, and then foments a rebellion in the United States. The movie is incredible. And I know that the book is going to be even better. And I know that I'm probably not going to be able to handle it just yet.
That sounds fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, wow.
I have sillier choices, but I went with that.
No, fair enough. Absolutely.
So when did you say that movie was made?
73.
I want to say it was the early 70s. Yeah, it's 3 or 4 sounds about right. Yeah, the studio was like, hey, all these black themed movies are making money, and they hired Ivan Dixon, who is from
was on Hogan's Heroes.
From Hogan's Heroes, to direct it, and he made a very faithful movie under their radar because they were just like, whatever, it'll be trash. They had no idea what it was about.
Wow.
It was out for like 2 days before it got recalled because everyone was afraid it was going to start a race war.
Huh.
Sounds like it's amazing.
Mm-hmm.
It's a really good movie, and I'm like, I can't wait to read this book. And I'm also like, I know I'm not in an emotional state to handle it right now. Gonna need a little time.
It sounds like the sort of thing might be good to read with other people, like a couple people reading it all together at once might be good.
Yeah. Because it gets into a lot of the movie gets into a lot of stuff, and I can't imagine how much deeper the book is.
I was trying to quickly see whether the movie is on any streaming services, and someone's uploaded it to YouTube. You didn't hear it here.
I was delighted to get a legit copy of it. It did get finally released on home video, but holy crap. I totally recommend people watching this movie because it's an eye-opener. It's amazing.
Excellent. I'm glad I know about it now.
Yeah, I've never heard of it. I'm glad you brought it up. It sounds amazing.
Michael, go ahead, Jess.
I was just going to say that there's an interesting piece in there about how much you're like, about what moves you more between a movie or a book. And
I'm kind of anxious to find out, but also a little afraid because, the movie got me constantly, and just sheer craftsman levels, but also just amazing raw performances, the issues that get brought up. There's an amazing sequence where they use some white passing members to go rob a bank, so it'll be blamed on white people. It's an amazing piece of work, and I need the fortitude because I really want to see does the book have the same emotional response for me? Is it greater? But yeah, I like your suggestions, Suzanne, of like having other people read it too, because
then you can talk about it together.
Yeah.
Excellent. All right. Well, we have to move on. Michael, you've given us the shipping news and the Communist Manifesto. What 3-word title beginning with "the" do you have for your third choice?
Oh, you know me so well. No. Okay, so I'm going back and forth between two things here, and I'm going to choose the first, which means nothing to you. Okay. Anyways, so basically, I feel sometimes I'm moving in an opposite direction to most of the people around me. All throughout my teens and 20s into the beginning of my PhD program, both because of the institutions that I went to and where I lived in the world, my reading was very much British literature, Canadian literature, Commonwealth literature, post-colonial literature. I read practically no American stuff. In my undergraduate degree, I took 20 English literature courses, and I think the number of Caribbean and Caribbean diaspora books outnumbered the books by white Americans like 2-1 that I read. Like I read practically nothing that was part of the American canon. I've never read Hemingway. I only finally read Moby Dick in my PhD. Things like that, things that are super canonical and are sort of assumed to be foundational, I haven't read. And then I've read all these weird 20th century post-colonial texts or obscure texts that people don't know that well. Anyways, my point being, I always felt like I would get along really well with Faulkner. I've never read anything by him. So I'm going to put down As I Lay Dying, which I don't know anything about other than that's the one of Faulkner's that Chris says that I would like or that I should read. When I said I haven't read Faulkner, that's slightly a lie. I read one short story in a first-year English course, and that was it. So that's my entire taste. But my sense of his reputation is that there's some sort of Southern Gothic. There's something strange about his work, and this is just a big unopened door. Like, I haven't read any Hemingway either. I don't particularly care to. Maybe I will someday. I haven't read any Faulkner. I'm intrigued. I feel like I'll like it. I feel like I'll get something out of it. So that's what I'm going to say. Like, I feel like I need to be working backwards and reading the super canonical texts that most people are working to get away from because I never got them.
I feel like you would find Hemingway really annoying.
I invited Simone de Rochefort to be on this episode to defend Hemingway or whatnot if should such attacks come up. But yes, I chose As I Lay Dying as the book you should read because it is the one that I guess it's the one that I finished. I've read a few others that I enjoyed but didn't finish, like Light in August, and I never got that far into Sound and Fury, which is hard to read. But As I Lay Dying is kind of a treat. It's about a woman who is dying, and it's told through multiple characters who are express their personality both through what they say, but also through their grammar in interesting ways, including, as I recall, there's a chapter towards the end where the woman who has since died, and most of it's as they're taking her off to be buried, she narrates a chapter post-death. So that's always fun.
Yes. See, these are the sorts of things I enjoy. So
I say go for it.
As I Lay Dying has a very special place in my heart because it was it was something I read in my undergrad, and it was one of the things that I had to sit with because I was giving a presentation and then an essay on it. And it was a sort of breakthrough book for me. And I wrote an essay about the river and the road in As I Lay Dying, and about the different kinds of pressure and the different ways of moving with or against pressures that are created by rivers and roads. And I am grateful to that book forever because it pushed me as a reader in a really good way. And it's just that last chapter that you were mentioning, Chris, it's just such a beautiful, amazing breakout chapter where you think that this woman has been her family's escape is not good. But her spirit endures in this, like, it's been 15 years since I read it, but it's, I look forward to reading your essay about it.
So is Faulkner bleak or hopeful?
Well, let's just say that what the Faulkner became a byword in my undergraduate group. it was, yeah.
The short story I read by him was kind of fucked up. So, like...
Yeah, I would definitely put the needle closer to bleak.
I may be interested.
definitely not a person you turn to for the feel good novel.
On a scale from 1 to Steinbeck.
Another person I haven't read.
Yeah, I think of him as being past Steinbeck, but I never got along with Steinbeck. That's a different story.
1.67 Steinbecks.
We're getting into the Giga Steinbeck range.
I keep trying to talk Chris into doing Steinbeck, and he's like, no.
We're going to have to have a different podcast about the books that we wish that Chris had read.
Yeah. Great idea.
You just read the Pearl in high school, the sadists.
No, that book is terrible. That book is just awful.
I had to read Of Mice and Men, which was fine, and the Grapes of Wrath, which I didn't read. and which was first time I got called on in class and hadn't read a book and completely failed in my ability to bullshit an answer because I was talking about things from chapter 3 when we were well past the halfway point of the book. Anywho, yeah, there's some Steinbeck that might be interesting. I mean, I don't despise him or anything. I just haven't enjoyed any books I've read.
Travels with Charlie.
Yeah, that's the one that I'd probably be most interested in. Although, again, I don't know. Jess, you gave us The City We Became and an untitled book that I have right in front of me. What is the third thing you're going to add to your collection?
Oh, well, I'm a little worried that I might scoop some of the other panelists, but I decided to pick a fictional book, pursuing one of your possible threads on this theme. And so I've chosen the Red Book of Westmarch, which is the book that the hobbits write over the course of the history of the Lord of the Rings. And I really love the Red Book of Westmarch because I've been thinking a lot about books that you contact only through a veil, or that you wish that you could read but you can't for some way. And I think that the Red Book of Westmarch just turns on its head what Tolkien is doing in the Lord of the Rings, in the sense that he writes this book that he pretends he's only translating a copy of a copy of a copy of. And why does he do that? And what is the relationship between history and fiction, especially in this world where there isn't really that much of fiction? Everything that could be fiction, like all the epics and poems that they sing, are all real events, or they're based on real events. So, yeah, I just find the Red Book of Westmarch a really wonderful book, and I haven't read it, and I never will. Yeah.
We pass the floor over to Jared for a response.
Well, I mean, yeah. Maybe if Marshall went up. I don't know. You could make your argument that by reading Lord of the Rings, you have read the Red Book of Westmarch, but yeah, it's such an interesting concept.
Something similar happens in Don Quixote, right? Because the author refers to this Arabic book by Cide Hamete being and it's translated, and what we're reading supposedly is the translation of that. So there's like a rich history of this kind of the source book. There's so many examples, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. You can't quite get them.
Yeah, it's weird with Tolkien because you don't know that you're reading a translation of the Red Book of Westmarch until the appendices. If you read that far, if you read the appendices, that's where it is, and it throws everything that happened before it, not into question exactly, but makes you think about the story has been told to me by a very specific person who may have reasons for saying or not saying certain things. And it's like, it's a weird, unreliable narrator thing that only happens if you read the footnotes.
And in retrospect.
Yeah. Yeah. It's an interesting choice. I like the concept of the Red Book, at least. So.
Yeah, I downloaded audiobooks of the Lord of the Rings, and I'm anxious to start on those because when I revisited The Hobbit, I got that sort of sense of the importance of the narrator, the narrative voice affecting how you're relating to the events. And it's not unique to him, but it's something I'd forgotten entirely about the entire series of novels, that it is very brokered interaction with this supposed history that, it really makes you think about all the other things you read.
I wonder if the audiobooks will include the appendices.
Oh, God.
With The Hobbit, the conceit of the Red Book is sort of funny because it allowed him to rejigger The Hobbit and justify Bilbo's taking of the ring. Because I haven't read the original version.
It's different.
Yeah, he just. I know the later version that he rewrote, which is the real version, and the original edition is Bilbo making himself look good. We all know how it plays out in the more normal edition, I think. Bilbo just finds it and keeps the ring, and that's it. I'm ashamed to say that I don't remember what happens the way it was originally written. But yeah, unreliable narrator just allows the author to decide, you know what, the earlier version, we'll skip that.
There's a neat thing about the fiction of the Red Book, if you sort of trace it against the Lord of the Rings, where it claims that Bilbo wrote not only The Hobbit, but also the first little leg of the Lord of the Rings, and then Frodo takes over, and then things go on from there. But at one point I tried to sort of pinpoint where it changed, and I decided that because, for instance, in the early chapter, there's a bit where like a fox walks by, and you get a little bit of a perspective on the fox's thoughts about all the hobbits, and then the fox just like continues his foxy business. And that would never happen in the later parts.
That's a very hobbitish part, isn't it?
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, and I decided that that the change happens around when they're in Rivendell, and there's a particular moment where the narrator stops calling Aragorn Strider and switches to calling him Aragorn, and I don't know. I just find it really interesting the way that the Red Book maps onto the different narratorial voices of the fictional characters, and also Tolkien's own revision patterns, and it's just a whole thing, and I love it. It's
super cool.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, before we get too much further into the Hobbit weeds,
That'll just be a whole episode of By-The-Bywater. We'll do an episode on the Red Book.
Megaphonic.fm/By-The-Bywater for more of your Tolkien deep dives. I noticed that we got a comment from Karen Ruff saying that Never Let Me Go is such a fantastic book. Of the books I've read in the last 20 years, it's the one that most lingers with me, and I am a sensitive soul and tend to steer away from traumatic reading. So yet another vote for leaving right now and starting. Okay, no, finish this video and then go read Never Let Me Go. Jared, meanwhile, now that I don't know if that was scooped from you or not, but you get your chance to add something to Tales of Nevèrÿon and Don Quixote. Is there a third book that I've read?
I can confidently say that you have not read this, because after talking about books that no longer exist or books that are fictional, I'm going to go with books that don't exist and cannot ever exist, because the author died. Either, depending on how you count, either the last 3 or last 4 books of the Gormenghast series. There were going to be 7 of them. 3 were written by Mervyn Peake. A 4th one was written by his wife from his notes. And then there are 3 that are just nowhere to be found. It's such an interesting story. This gigantic crumbling castle with its sort of Dickens on acid vibe. And then in the 3rd book, the last book that Mervyn Peake wrote, the protagonist is out in something that kind of resembles the real world, but also has science fiction elements like flying like drones even. And then the 4th book, written by his wife, the protagonist ends up in the real world in England. And then that's it. And that's all we get. And we'll never know what happens after that point. And I often think about what's left, what could be left after that. And I wish I could read them, but never, alas.
Well, now that I know that the Gormenghast books were never finished, I can't read them.
So the story as is it ends in a, I wouldn't recommend reading the 4th book necessarily, but at the end of the 3rd book, it's a satisfying end, actually. I don't want to spoil anything for anybody who may care about that kind of thing, but it marks a distinct endpoint in the life of the protagonist, and I'm fine with it ending there. But I would like the last 4.
Fair enough. It is always interesting when you've got a series. I mean, there are other ones like this, but the series where it goes on too long, and so, for example, like The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is a 4-novel trilogy, not 5. That last book, nope. But it is also interesting, when that happens and someone else takes over writing. Although, was that one of the cases where like she had a bigger hand in writing the novels than is usually attributed to her, or no?
No.
Okay.
You can tell because the fourth book is not that great.
All right. Fair enough. Well, strong support from Nadia on your choice of the unwritten Gormenghast books. But it is now Suzanne's turn after Avision du Coq and Never Let Me Go. What shall be joining them in the unread pile?
Well, I was talking a little bit earlier about lost books, so books that are lost to us in general. And there's this book that I've been looking for a long, long time. And it's not the case that I've never read it, but I desperately want to read it. This is a book that I had as a child. I must have picked it up at one of my grandparents' houses. It was an old book bound in sort of like purpley red cloth. It was old then. So it must have been from like at the latest, like the 20s or something like this. It was an old book. And it was titled something like English Fairy Tales. And I've been looking for this book and looking for it and looking. It's something like that. Might not have been exactly English fairy tales, but something like that. And I remember the stories in it. Some of them more clearly than others. There was one called Katya and the Devil. The very last story in the collection was called The Boggart. But the collection the story I remember best from that collection was called The Well at the World's End. And it was a typical fairy tale kind of structure. There's a girl, she finds a frog, and the frog makes her promise to do various things. And there's a refrain in it where he says, for example, give me some water, for example. So give me some water, my hinny, my heart. Give me some water, my own darling. Remember the promise you made to me at the well of the world's end. So this rhyme appears several times in the story. And I've been able to find traces of some of the individual stories and collections, but I've never found that book. So the book I really, really want to read more than I think probably any other book is, other than those lost books by Chaucer and Christina Pizan, is this book of fairy tales that I had and I loved and lost track of when I was still relatively young, but I remember it so vividly. So English Fairy Tales, whatever that book exactly was called.
Title unknown.
Well, sorry, I'm now desperately Googling.
It's hard because it's an incredibly common kind of title, and I'm not sure that's exactly the title. And I know that the Boggart story is the last one in the collection, and I know that those are the right titles of those other two stories, Katya and the Devil and The Well at the World's End. And I dimly remember some of the other stories. And I would love to find that book again.
Mm-hmm. There's also a novel, The Well at the World's End, by William Morris. I don't know if that's related.
Yeah, I think because it's I think northern. It's either English or Scottish. Like it's a northern fairy tale, and so he fleshed it out into a novel at some point. I found that too when I was like searching. So anybody who finds me this book will make me super happy. So just to say.
All right, everyone start hunting.
Yeah,
I'm doing it. I'm hunting as I can.
It's not easy. It's not easy.
No, I'll need a few. I need a few more details about when it was. I think you mentioned it, but I'll look at that later when we're not live.
You're hosting a show right
now.
Okay. I do have really strong memories of reading my mother's and my aunt's like anthologies from school, like in the 50s, like when I was like, in 1989, 1990, when I was like a kid. And they always felt like there's something weird because the books are like themselves are so old, and like an old book is like magic when you're a small child, and the stories themselves are like just so different from everything else you've seen because enough time has passed by. So I've had a similar experience, although I don't have that same sort of tantalizing desire to like revisit it, but I recognize that feeling.
Yeah, they're like magic. The bookiness of it. Jess, we were talking before about the bookiness of that Poti book of Chris's. There's something about sometimes those books that feel like they're, especially when you're a kid and you're reading, they're like a portal. And it's not just the content, like it's not just the meaning of the story, it's the thing too.
Yeah. All right. Well, that was an excellent choice, although one that I'm going to have a very hard time linking and putting on our bookshop.org link.
You should have anticipated this problem.
It's true.
You're not going to be able to sleep, are you?
I'll do a little more digging after this, and
challenge extended.
Yeah. It's my turn for the final one and the final round. So we recently did an episode on the Spouter-Inn about Jane Austen's Emma, in which I talked about how I had read all of Emma's main novels, let's say, not necessarily the Sendidian or whatever that's called, but except for one of them. I haven't read Mansfield Park, which is not the choice I'm making. But I didn't read that because I wanted to save one for later. Sometimes you want to deny yourself pleasure so that you know that there's a Jane Austen book that you've never read waiting for you, and that is exciting. Similarly, my favorite author, one of my favorite authors, let's say, is a guy named Georges Perec. He was a French writer in the 20th century, mid-20th century. He also passed away young from cancer because he was an inveterate smoker, as I recall. That's why he died. And he was a really interesting writer. He was a member of a group called the Oulipo, which is a group of people who tried to think about mathematical constraints that they could put on writing and forms that would evolve from the potential inherent in mathematical ideas. He's most famously known for having written a novel without the letter E in it, which was translated into English as a void. In the original French, it's La Disparition, which sounds like a cute gimmick or maybe a tedious gimmick, depending on who you are. It's the sort of thing that appeals to me. But if you read it, the characters all find out. They all sort of realize one by one that the letter E is missing, and that's what's so weird about the world right now. And as soon as they are about to tell anybody about it, they get disappeared, much like Perec's parents were disappeared during World War II. So there's this weird political undercurrent to how he's thinking about this. So that's that book, which I have read. It's pretty good in translation. I have read a lot of Georges Perec. We're going to be doing his book W, or The Memory of Childhood, soon this summer for the Spouter-Inn, which I'm excited about. It's another weird autobiography. I've read a big, massive biography of him, which is written by his translator, which is always weird because then I'm used to the translator's voice being his voice. Therefore, it felt like he was writing his own biography after he had died, which is strange. I've read some of his novels in French. I have W in French, but I haven't read it in French. So I've invested a lot. His other most famous book, though, and what most people consider his masterwork, is a book called Life, a User's Manual, which I never managed to get through. It's a big book. It's tales of people who live in an apartment complex, and it sort of travels through it in a weird way that involves knights moves, and it's all complicated. It's big, and it's a bunch of little stories of it, and it just didn't hook me. Every time I've tried it, I've fallen off it, and it feels so weird to have the masterpiece of your favorite author be the book you haven't read. It's a weird sensation. Obviously, that means I get to rep for the other books and say they're quite good. But it just feels like a weird lack. And I don't know. I wanted to talk about that particular flavor of not having read a book as my last choice. So Georges Perec, Life, a User's Manual. Probably good. I'll try it again someday soon.
Do you know anybody? Like, do you have any friends who have read it, who liked it? In other words, it's one thing for a book to have a big reputation. It's another thing to know people who talk about it in a meaningful way.
That's a good question. I can't think of any friends who've talked about it that way. And if you are a friend who's talked about it to me that way, I apologize. I don't know. I can't think of any right now. But I can't think of many people who've read many of his books, which is a shame because he's really terrific. Or I think so. He works with my brain chemistry. But that's a really good point. That is my final pick. And that means we're going to talk about the other books that we were thinking about. We're going to go through and just quickly list them off. And also, if anybody here has any other comments that they... well, Nadia, maybe we will, at some point, when I have time to read a book that's this thick, we will talk about it together. We'll figure something out. But, so we're going to go around and we're going to list off the books that we were also thinking about but didn't make our top 3 selections. Also, if you are watching this live and there are any books that you... Oh, hold on. Karen Ruff thinks she has your book. I don't know if she does or not. Well, anyway, we'll look at that later. That was Suzanne's fairy tale book.
No.
She thinks so, God. But we'll see. But anywho, if you are in the comments and there is a particular book that you haven't read that you want to mention, please mention it. Anyone there at all. All right. So Sean, we will start with you. You had as your choices Norbert Jacques' The Testament of Dr. Mabuse, which was untranslated. Fuyumi Ono's The 12 Kingdoms, Sea of Shadow, which translation wasn't finished. And Sam Greeley's The Spook Who Sat by the Door, which may be a little too rough and relevant for right now. What else was on your mind?
I have 2 others that I want to read. And one, so really quick. 16th century Chinese novel, one of the great Chinese novels, the Journey to the West. There's a famous translation that I have read by, I want to say, Arthur Whaley, which is only 30 out of the 100 chapters. And it's great. It's great stuff, a lot of fun, real mythic, interesting blend of Buddhism and folklore. But I want to read the full 100 chapters. And I have a friend who did Chinese studies who's like, no, you don't. You don't. But I do. I really do. So apparently there was in the 80s full translation over 4 volumes done. And I want to track that down and read that. Less long, but also quite lengthy, is Michael Chabon's Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay.
Ooh, that's really good.
Which I have, but it's a phone book, and my reading time is limited. But my God, if anything was ever custom made for me, the story of 2 New York kids writing comics through World War II, that's my jam. And then the last one is, I have never wanted to read this. I don't know why I have 2 copies of it, but it's Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged. I've been cleaning my library and there are 2 copies of this. So
like Gideon's Bible, they just show up.
They do.
All right. Well, we've got our first contest here. If you just put your name in the comments, we'll select one lucky winner to receive one of those copies.
We'll punish you for winning.
Oh, very good. All right. So those were Sean's picks. And Michael, you had the shipping news, the Communist Manifesto, and As I Lay Dying. What else have you been thinking about?
So the list of books that I haven't read is indeed extremely long. And I only put ones down here on the page that I thought I might have at least a little bit of something to say about. So like I've always meant to read Ursula K. Le Guin. And I heard one of her short stories, her non-fantasy works, just one of the ones that's set in like coastal Oregon, when I was driving one time on CBC, and it was just beautiful. And I really wanted to, I was like, oh, I should read that. Le Guin's so good. Everyone loves her. I should really read that. But that's the extent of what I can say. So books like that I did not list. So the ones that are here are ones that I thought I might be able to talk about. Paradise Lost. There was a rumor going around, because there's very little guidance from our department, and so folk wisdom sprouted up like mushrooms after rain, that you could not pass your comprehensive exams in the PhD program in our English department if you didn't mention Paradise Lost. And I wanted to put it to the test, and I did, and I won.
Good job.
Slaughterhouse 5. The Road. Because although we've decided it is not a good book, I had a real early 20s thing for dystopias and post-apocalyptic scenario. And so I really wanted to read it back then, and I just never gave into it. The Watchmen and V for Vendetta, both Alan Moore. Never Let Me Go, which got scooped. Beloved. I have read The Song of Solomon. I'm not a Toni Morrison virgin, but Beloved and The Bluest Eye are like the 2 like most famous ones. And yes, I know Watchmen is there. I probably should read it like tonight. Take it home tonight. And then I just have a giant thing in all caps, Russians. All of them. I haven't read Tolstoy. I haven't read Dostoevsky. I haven't read Chekhov. I tried to read The Master and Margarita because people said that I would like it, and they were probably right, but I just couldn't make my way through the first 50 pages or so.
Yeah, same.
Yeah.
Although Alexandre Tolstoy's Alida is kind of fun. It's a breezy read. It's early communist sci-fi. It's yeah.
Oh yeah, early Soviet stuff is fantastic. I've not read any of the big Russians, but I've read a lot of a lot for an American white guy, a lot of early Soviet stuff, and it's generally been terrific.
Yeah. I mean, in the English department, we weren't supposed to work with translations. And like, I spent like a long time in the PhD program, and it felt like anything I read should be at least somewhat useful to like my studies. So I was like, oh, I can't read anything in translation ever, apparently. And I'm still waiting for my brain to heal. So.
All right. Excellent. Jess, you had The City We Became. This book that has no name, and the Red Book of Westmarch. What else have you been thinking about?
Oh, I want to mention two. One is Gideon the Ninth by Tamsin Muir. I haven't read it yet. I'm really excited to. It's about lesbian necromancers in a Gothic castle in space.
Amazing.
Hello.
But the other one is by Sarah Pinsker, and I want to thank my friend Genevieve Mackay for telling me about it. It's called A Song for a New Day, and it came out last year, and it's about musicians having to deal with the fact that public performances have been outlawed because of a global pandemic.
Wow.
And I gather that it won the Nebula Award last year, and I bet the author is kicking himself now. Because it was obviously a prophecy rather than a novel, and they billed it badly. Anyway, so I'm impressed by how much sci-fi and fantasy there is in this conversation. But that's one that I'm really excited to read. A Song for a New Day by Sarah Pinsker.
Excellent. A note from Nadia, who still hasn't admitted to what she has. Well, I guess she has admitted to a few books she hasn't read in this, But yes, all right, very good. Jared, you had Tales of Nevèrÿon, Don Quixote, and the final unwritten Norman Gast books. What else have you been thinking about?
So Jazz by Toni Morrison. I've read several Toni Morrison books. I haven't read all of them. So, but Jazz is apparently the second in an unofficial trilogy beginning with Beloved. So I'll read that next eventually. I haven't yet. Finnegan's Wake by James Joyce. I hate James Joyce. I'm not going to read Finnegan's Wake. Sorry.
I mean, it is my canonical favorite book in the sense that, like, when you decide on a book to answer the question, "What's your favorite book?"
Mm-hmm.
But it's not a book. I spent a lot of time on it when I was in my early 20s, and it's very hard for me to return to now. And if it's not the sort of thing that appeals to you, and I don't have any reason for thinking this would be your kind of book, I can't recommend it. It's a very hard book with very specific rewards that may not work with your brain chemistry.
No, I'm fine with long and weird, but not that particular flavor of long and weird. Binti by Nnedi Okorafor, which is it's a sci-fi novella, I think. Watchmen, which I have so far refused to read because in art school, if you said, "Oh, yeah, I'm in a comics class," everybody would go, "Oh, have you read Watchmen?" Like, no, I haven't fucking read Watchmen. I'm reading Calvin and Hobbes. There's just a specific kind of Watchmen fanboy that's really driven me off it for this long, which is not a good reason not to read something necessarily. But Watchmen, and finally, go ahead.
I was just going to say, Watchmen is so much better than the rabid fans made.
I'm sure it is. I also just have a hard time with Ellen Moore in general.
It's also
for whatever
not
reason.
as good as they think.
And my last book, which I was afraid when Chris started talking about Jane Austen that he would snipe, is Lady Susan, which is the only thing by her I think that I haven't read.
I haven't read that either, but that falls in the miscellany that isn't, the 6 main novels.
Yeah, she wrote, which was like 16 or something. I don't know.
The Jane Austen Juvenilia I have read is fucking hilarious.
She's so funny. Teenage Jane is the best.
The history of England by
by a prejudiced historian.
Partial and prejudiced historian.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite things.
That one's super good. All right, excellent. Suzanne, you had Avision du Coq, you had Never Let Me Go, and you had English Fairy Tales, which was that the right book?
It's similar. It's not exactly the book. And the way you can tell if it's the right book is the Boggart is the last one. And so there's some overlap, but it's not exactly right. Alas, because I was very excited there for a second.
Okay.
So I have a few in the bring out your dead category. Chris, you were mentioning having a situation where there's an author you really love, and I think you mentioned you're saving a book, right, that you'd like to read by them. And for me, it's this collection of essays by George Orwell. I really love Orwell, and I've read a number of his essays, here and there, and I love essays in general. So I'm like, this book has got to be terrific. It's been sitting around for like 5 years because it's so delicious. I'm just like,
as somebody who has read the complete 4-volume, all of George Orwell's essays, yeah, it's a good collection, I'm sure. Like any subset of that is fantastic.
So so we'll probably be back to that at some point. This book by David Harvey, A Companion to Marx's Capital. I was thinking about this when we were talking about the Communist Manifesto a little earlier. I tried to read Marx's Capital. I'm like, this is hard. And so I thought, David Harvey, he's really interesting and smart, and he's written a companion to make it easy to understand Marx's Capital. And no.
From what little I've dabbled in that book, it's much harder to read than Capital.
I really want to read it, but no. And then lastly, this book. I have not read this book.
Ah!
Oh, don't.
It's shit, right?
No.
It's not fun. It's not fun.
It's awful.
I think you need to be a certain kind of 16-year-old. Apologies to anyone who likes it.
Yeah, so no.
Boy.
So that's my
What
dead.
my mother ever admitted to hating.
The only part I liked about that one was no.
There are no parts.
I will say, if you want to, there's one particular chapter in Capital, which you could just read that chapter. It's mostly a description of the working conditions of workers in that time period, and it's really moving and interesting, and it's sort of unexpected as you're reading like economic theory to have like a massive, it's like 100 pages as I recall, I could be wrong, but like a big chapter on, let's just look at how people are doing. Oh, they're doing badly. Let me go into great detail, because economics books should probably make you uncomfortable.
That's
Really good. That is also about where I stopped reading the book, because I also left that class. I was taking a Marx class in my final semester in my undergrad before coming to Toronto for grad school. And the professor who was teaching that class was totally phoning it in. It was absolutely terrible. And later, he got reprimanded for bringing a gun into the classroom and showing it off after class. So literally dodged a bullet there, I suppose. Oh, boy.
Wow.
My selections were Lord of the Rings, Audre Lorde Zami, A New Spelling of My Name, and George Perrec's Life and Users Manual, and the other books that I've been thinking about. I haven't read nearly enough literature from Africa, and from a lot of other places, I suppose, but that feels like a huge gap in my mental library. I had on the list the Quran, which I've read a little tiny bit of. I understand that reading the Quran is not quite the same thing as reading up on Islamic lives, Islamic theology, or Islamic, whatever, real life. But nevertheless, I feel like I should have a little bit more familiarity with it. I've got all poetry written in the last few years. I've written about this in a essay that was in a collection that Suzanne and our friend Caitlin Heller put out, which you can find. But grad school really burned my ability to read poetry, and I have not quite regained it yet. So that's sad. But if you're a friend of mine who is a poet and you wrote a book in the last couple of years, I haven't read it yet. I've probably bought it because I haven't stopped buying poetry, but I have not read much since 2016-ish. And what do I have here? Oh, yeah. Basically all the other books ever. Yeah. Honestly, like, given world enough and time, I would read everything. Because even that I wouldn't enjoy it, but there's definitely a part of my brain which wants to 100% literature, as the video gamers might say. So and that would be in all languages, which of course I'd have to learn, and etc. And probably I'd have to write some of the fictional ones. Is there anything else that anybody wants? We're going on a little bit long, but is there anything else that anybody wants to say to wrap up this idea of the books that we haven't read? It's been a lovely discussion, I thought.
And I'm excited to have some books that look fantastic, like the Delany one and the Jemisin one. I'm excited by those. And that is the Delany by the door.
That's the Delany book that I've been most thinking we would do if we did a Delany book for Spouter-Inn. Although, there's lots to choose from.
Yeah, the downside of this this episode is that now my list is longer.
Yeah, Yep. That is, you just got to ride that wave. You just have to ride it. Well, thank you very much to all of the panelists here. From Sean, I'm not even going to say each of you in time, but Sean and Jared and Susanna and Jess and Michael, thank you all. And this has been Take Your Pick. Go check out the various podcasts and such that these hosts over at megaphonic.fm. 3 of them are literary podcasts, although one of them is on hiatus. Not that anyone's sick, but just that it's very hard to record a podcast when you have young children at home and you are taking care of them all the time. It really drives you crazy. Anyway, we'll be back next week with another great topic. Until then, bye!
Bye.